Today's exhortation is provided by Brother Phil Capusta. His subject is, up there on the screen, the rich man's secret. In preparation, he's asked that we read two readings, Luke 18. Luke 18, 9 through 14. And he spake this parable unto certain which trusted in themselves that they were righteous, and despised others. Two men went up to the temple to pray, the one a Pharisee and the other a publican. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself: God, I thank thee that I am not as the other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. I fast twice in the week, I give tithes of all I possess. And the publican, standing up afar off, would not lift up so much as his eyes unto heaven, but smote upon his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified, rather than the other. For everyone that exalts himself shall be abased. He that humbles himself shall be exalted. In Micah chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. Micah 6:1. Hear ye now what the Lord says. Arise, contend before the mountains, and let the hills hear thy voice. Hear ye, O mountains, the Lord's controversy, and you strong foundations of the earth. For the Lord has a controversy with his people, and he will plead with Israel. O my people, what have I done unto thee, and wherein have I wearied thee? Testify against me. For I brought thee up out of the land of Egypt, and redeemed thee out of the house of servants. And I sent before thee Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. O my people, remember now that Balak, king of Moab, consulted. What Balak, king of Moab, consulted, and what Balaam, the son of Beor, answered him from Shittim unto Gilgal, that ye may know the righteousness of the Lord. Wherewith shall I come before the Lord, and bow myself before the high God? Shall I come before him with burnt offerings, and calves of a year old? Will the Lord be pleased with thousands of rams, or with 10,000s of rivers of oil? Shall I give my firstborn for my transgression, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? He has showed you, O man, what is good. And what does the Lord require of thee but to do justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God? We'll give our attention to Brother Phil.
All right, ready to go. Good morning to everyone. I would like to start out this morning's exhortation by introducing you to the man behind the title of this exhortation. In other words, the rich man. Some of you may recognize his name. It is Rothschild. Now, both the man and his descendants became fabulously rich. They have also been the subject of many anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, both because they were Jewish and because they were a very wealthy family who established large banking empires throughout Europe over multiple generations. But this exhortation is not about conspiracy theories, nor is it about anti-Semitism, nor is it about banking. This exhortation is about something which you would not expect to be found in the circles of the wealthy. But before I get to that topic, I need to properly introduce you to the patriarch of this well-known and wealthy family. Although this man's descendants went on to possess the largest private fortune in the world by the 19th century, the rich man who I want to bring to your attention this morning, he was actually born under very humble circumstances. In fact, he was born in a Jewish ghetto. This is the man I'm referring to, and his name is Meyer Amschel Rothschild. He's the rich man that this exhortation is named in or referring to. He was born in Frankfurt, Germany in the year 1744, and he lived there for most of his adult life. For a significant part of that life, he lived in this house here in the Jewish ghetto. His family had lived there for multiple generations. This house had stood there and had stood there even after he had left it for several hundred years. It was only razed somewhere in the 1900s as a result of the destruction of World War II. Now, this photo is the best one I could find online. It was taken in obviously black and white. However, if this photo had been taken in color, you might have seen in this photo a red sign or a red shield in front of the house. And this would have been because back before they had house numbers, something we take for granted, back before they had house numbers, houses and the occupants of those houses were identified by some type of shape or, in this case, color. And in front of this house would have been a red-colored sign. And it is this red sign from which the Rothschilds get their name. You see, in the German language, Rot is the color red. And the word shield means shield or sign. So when you put those together, you end up with Rothschild, or the red shield, the red sign. Now, the thing is, we in the West, as non-Germans, we butcher the pronunciation of this contraction. It really should be Rothschild, but we say Rothschild, and that's what I'm going to use throughout this talk. So, among these Rothschilds or Rothschilds that were living in this house in the 1700s was one named Meyer Rothschild. Now, Meyer followed in the footsteps of his father, who unfortunately died very early, leaving Meyer an orphan. Before his father died, his father was a trader of goods, and he was also a trader of currency. He also provided coins to the wealthy upper class. And this is where Meyer got his big break. He went on to specialize in rare coins, which brought him to the attention and contact with various princes of the region. And one thing led to another, and Meyer became the banker of Crown Prince Wilhelm, and also later for Britain, especially when Britain went to war and needed German mercenaries. Now, I could spend quite a lot of time recounting Meyer's life and how he became so wealthy, but that would take too much time. Let me just say that Forbes magazine in 2005 ranked Meyer Rothschild as number 7 in their list of the 20 most influential businessmen of all time. It therefore should not surprise us to learn that Meyer regularly circulated among the wealthy and the royal circles as a financier to Europe's kings and queens. Now, I want to remind you, in case you missed it, that Meyer Rothschild was Jewish. Moreover, despite his enormous wealth that he eventually earned and the fame that came with it, despite this, he remained steadfastly committed to his Jewish faith. And he did his very best to observe the Torah. That is, he strove to follow that which was taught in the first 5 books of the Bible. And there's one last thing that I want to share with you that I need to explain about Rothschild, and it's this last detail that will bring me to the topic that I want to discuss and focus in on for the rest of this exhortation. Besides being wealthy and famous, Meyer Rothschild was an exceedingly humble man. This blend of extreme fame and wealth and humility is a rare anomaly. You normally don't associate humility with people who are exceedingly wealthy and famous. In fact, quite the opposite. So, what exactly was the secret to his pious and grounded life? Well, let me first tell you a story which I believe will help explain Rothschild's secret. Now, one day, Rothschild was hosting a guest at his mansion. And at the end of his busy workday, Rothschild and this guest went for a stroll among the mansion's expansive gardens. And as they walked, deep in conversation, they passed by a small, quaint cottage within the confines of the mansion. And this guest asked Rothschild about the purpose of this cottage. Rothschild replied that it was his private office, which the guest thought about and then was a little bit puzzled. He said, "Don't you have a private office in your home? Why do you need 2 private offices?" Well, the guest said evidently struck a nerve, and Rothschild didn't want to talk about it. He wanted to change the subject, hoping that his guest would not belabor the issue. But his guest persisted, and Rothschild finally capitulated and took the guest closer to the cottage. When he got to the door of this small cottage, he reached into his pocket and removed a key to open the door. He then turned to his guest and told him that even his own family members had never seen the inside of this cottage. When the guests walked inside and saw the interior, he was shocked. For you see, inside this cottage, it was just a single room, and it was completely empty, except for one thing. In the middle of the room sat a coffin. And inside the coffin were burial clothes and a book. It was a Jewish religious book. It contained prayers that you recite as you're dying. Now, Rothschild, anticipating this, had to explain. His guest was shocked, and he needed an explanation. So Rothschild told him, "My professional life affords me the opportunity to interact with Europe's kings, princes, the rich, and the famous. I know that I can easily slip into the pitfall of arrogance and start believing that it is entirely to my own power and might. So, for this reason, he's referring to his wealth. So for this reason, at least once a day, I try to slip out into the garden and enter into this cottage. I wrap myself with the burial shrouds, I lie in the coffin, and I recite the final prayers and confession. This keeps me grounded and humble. What Meyer Rothschild was doing was in many ways taking the words of Moses as found in Deuteronomy to heart. For in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 8, Moses warns the fledgling nation of Israel as they were about to enter into the promised land. Moses warned them with these words, "Take care lest you forget the Lord your God, lest you eat and be satisfied and build good houses and settle and increase silver and gold for yourselves, and everything that you have will increase, and your heart will become haughty, and you will forget the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt." Moses also, continuing a few verses later, warned them that you may say in your heart, "My strength and the might of my hand made me all this wealth." Remember that the Lord your God is the one that gave you strength to make wealth. Meyer Rothschild internalized this warning given by Moses, and he took extreme measures to ensure that he never forgot that his wealth and fame were a gift from God. Which brings me to the primary subject of this exhortation, and that is humility. If we wish to measure the importance of humility as a virtue, I believe there's no better way than to recall the stress given to it by the prophet Micah. Now, our brother had read a passage from Micah 6, but the one that stands out the most in respect to this particular topic is found in verse 8. He, God that is, has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you, but to do justice, and to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. Now, the Bible is a wonderful tool to learn humility from. There are many examples of humility in the Bible. I want to start this morning looking at a few of them, starting with Saul, Israel's first king. Now, it's easily overlooked, but Saul was a humble man before and at the beginning of his reign as king. Recall that when the people wanted to acclaim Saul as king, they could not find him. And the reason was he was hiding, which I suppose was done because he did not feel himself worthy to be king. In this case, he was showing humility. Unfortunately, God later would change, or should say, God would later turn away from Saul because of a change in Saul's heart. When Saul had power, he became arrogant, and as a result lost God's favor. The next individual I wanted to look at was David, the forgotten shepherd boy, who was anointed to replace Saul when Saul had when he no longer was fit to serve as God's regent. Now, in this son of Jesse, there was a deep strain of humility. one which seems to have deepened rather than lessened in the course of his life. Now, I recognize that David is not without his faults, but David did maintain a spirit of humility throughout his reign, much more than his predecessor, and even beyond those who would follow him on the throne. For example, when his son Absalom revolted against him, David did not stay in Jerusalem and try to fight it out. Rather, David fled. And if you remember the story, he didn't flee alone. There were many that went out and followed after him, faithful men and his loyal supporters who wished to follow him into exile. Now, among that group of men, you recall there was one, the priest Zadok, and Zadok brought with him the Ark of the Covenant. You could say, if you were to read between the lines, you could think that this high priest was saying, it doesn't matter about Jerusalem, David. You are the true king. And where the true king is, there the ark of God should follow. That's basically what Zadok was saying. But what was David's response to Zadok? Well, from 2 Samuel, chapter 15, we find David's response. Return the ark of God to the city. If I find favor in the sight of the Lord, then he will bring me back again and show me both it and his habitation. But if he should say thus, I have no delight in you, behold, here I am. Let him do to me as seems good to him. It's actually amazing if you stop and think about it. After all the years that David had ruled Israel for God, he was still ready to admit that maybe he was not good enough to continue as king, that maybe he deserved to lose his throne. And he did not refuse to give up the throne like Saul did. It would have been natural for David to have asked himself, what have I done to deserve this? And for David to take the attitude, God can't really mean for me to lose my kingship. Surely God must be expecting me to defend myself and to show to others that they cannot put away God's anointed one. But instead, David showed incredible humility, and as we know, he did in fact find favor with God and was eventually restored to his throne. It's amazing what a humble spirit can do and the results that follow. For example, I'm going to give you two more kings. These were Ahab and Manasseh. Now, these two kings were idolaters and were declared to be wicked in the sight of God. Here's what we find in 1 Kings regarding King Ahab from chapter 21. But there was none like unto Ahab, which did sell himself to work wickedness in the sight of the Lord, whom Jezebel his wife stirred up. And he did very abominably in following idols, according to all things as did the Amorites, whom the Lord cast out before the children of Israel. Remember how Jezebel had Naboth murdered because Ahab had wanted Naboth's vineyard. Remember the story? Remember how God instructed the prophet Elijah after the dirty deed was done? Elijah went to Ahab and rebuked Ahab for his complicity in this wicked deed. And Elijah told Ahab what was going to happen to him and to his dynasty. Normally, this is where I put a slide up and have the words to read along. I'm not going to do that because some might consider it a bit R-rated. However, I will say that Elijah's words to Ahab involved dogs and scavengers eating the flesh of his wife and his children. Enough said. Do you remember, though, what happened after that? Ahab, hearing of God's judgment from the mouth of Elijah, he humbled himself. It's not something you would think of being associated with Ahab. But it was then, after Ahab humbles himself before God, that God said this to Elijah. Have you seen that Ahab has humbled himself before me? Since he has humbled himself before me, I will not bring this evil in his time. Something similar took place in the life of Manasseh, which was another wicked king. Manasseh, as a result of his wickedness, found himself taken captive into Babylon or Mesopotamia by the Assyrians. And this is what's written briefly about Manasseh. Manasseh killed so many innocent people, he stained Jerusalem with their blood from end to end, in addition to encouraging Judah to sin by doing evil in the sight of the Lord. Now, it was only after Manasseh had lost his throne and was carried away captive into a foreign land that this was written of him. He, Manasseh, begged the Lord his God for help and humbled himself before the God of his ancestors. When Manasseh prayed, the Lord heard him and had pity on him, so the Lord let him return to Jerusalem and to his kingdom. The takeaway lesson from these two examples is that if God had mercy on Manasseh and Ahab because they humbled themselves, then surely, too, we can find God's mercy if we likewise humble ourselves before him. Now, I don't advise that we go about reaching a state of humility in the same way that these two kings did, provoking God to anger and then suffering under his chastening rod is not recommended. There are easier and there are better ways to find humility. To that end, I would like to, for the rest of this exhortation, share a few of these ways with you. But before we get started, the first thing we need to recognize with regards to humility is that humility is a mindset. To get this truth across, I'm going to share with you what an 18th century rabbi by the name of Ramhel once told his students who wanted to know the secret to his humility. Ramhel, probably butchering his name, but he outlined a 6-step formula to his disciples. And the first step was we need to modify the way that we speak. We, he said, they should speak gently and kindly. This brings to mind Ecclesiastes 5:2, which could be helpful. Be not rash with thy mouth, and let not thine heart be hasty to utter anything before God. For God is in heaven, and thou upon earth. Therefore, let thy words be few. Another scripture that I think is in line with what Ramhel was suggesting here is Proverbs 10:10, where we find, where words are many, sin is not wanting, but he who restrains his lips does well. Step 2 of Ramhel's advice to his disciples is we should not walk with a swagger. In other words, we should not try to stand out from a crowd. This not only pertains to how we move our arms and our legs, but also in how we dress. Humility does not put on a show, in other words, and seek to stand out by means of clothing or decoration. Scripture that comes to mind can be found in 1 Peter 3:3, where he instructs Christian women, don't let your beauty consist of outward things like elaborate hairstyles and wearing gold jewelry, but rather what is inside the heart, the imperishable quality of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. Step number 3 to humility, according to Rabbi Ramchal, we should not jostle for the most prominent seat in a room. I believe this is saying, or is another way of saying, this would be to not strive to be number one in social settings. I believe we could also apply this to an ecclesial setting. Remember Jesus' words regarding the scribes and the Pharisees, how they desired to stand out above all others in the realm of religion. This is not humility. Moving on, step 4. Remain silent in the face of insult. The logic behind this is that arrogant people usually hold themselves in high regard, and they take, therefore, offense at the smallest slight. In contrast, humble people, while they recognize their self-worth, they're comfortable with themselves. The humble don't become indignant at an offense from others. Step 5. Run away from honor and recognition. This applies especially in the context of leadership. If you should find yourself in a leadership position, as a manager perhaps, or some other role, maybe as the head of a household, tell yourself this: it's an opportunity for service. And if you need a mental picture for this one, simply remember how Jesus washed the feet of his disciples. And also remember from Mark 10 that Jesus said, the Son of Man came not to be the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Step 6. Give honor to other people. How do we do that? Well, we can start by simply greeting people in a warm manner, and then go on to be extremely careful not to disrespect the other person in what we say to them. This also means cutting out the kidding and the ribbing and sometimes the childish jesting, which can come from familiarity with another person. So these are the 6 steps that Rabbi Ramchal shared with his disciples. And reflecting on these, I think I can probably add more to these. First of all, let's not forget our old friend Meyer Rothschild and his secret. He remained humble by daily reflecting on the fact that one day he would die. Now, although I do not suggest that you run out and buy a coffin and place it in the middle of your living room, we can maintain a healthy perspective on our mortal condition by regularly reflecting upon the Scriptures. For in so doing, we will frequently come across a reminder of our frail state in our daily readings. For example, I'll share a few with you this morning. Psalm 103, verses 14 through 17. For he, God, knoweth our frame. He remembereth that we are but dust. As for man, his days are as grass, as a flower of the field, so he flourisheth. For the wind passeth over it, and it is gone, and the place thereof shall know it no more. But the mercy of the Lord is from everlasting to everlasting upon them that fear him. In Psalm 39, we find this, verse 4 and 5. Make me to know mine end and the measure of my days, what it is, that I may know how frail I am. Behold, thou hast made my days as an handbreadth, and mine age is as nothing before thee. Verily, every man at his best state is altogether vanity. Isaiah 40 gives us a similar assessment of mankind in verses 6 and 7. All flesh is grass, and all the goodliness thereof is as the flower of the field. The grass withereth, the flower fadeth, because the Spirit of the Lord bloweth upon it. Surely the people is grass. And then there is this one from Abraham, who stood before the Lord and said, Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord, I, who am but dust and ashes. I could keep going, but you get the idea. Keeping a healthy view on the brevity of life is another way to become and to remain humble. Now, moving on from Rabbi Ramchal and Baron Rothschild, I'd like to point out a few additional things that I think the Bible tells us about humility. And this next truth should be no secret, and that is, the enemy of humility is pride. For just as light dispels darkness, so too does an attitude of pride cast out humility. I seem to have a thing on Jewish rabbis because I'm going to introduce another one to you here. This one's from the 13th century, and his name is Nachmanides. And on the subject of pride, he wrote this. He must have been writing to his son. And now, my son, understand clearly that one who is arrogant in his heart towards other people rebels against the sovereignty of heaven. For such a one glorifies himself in God's own robes. And then he goes on to explain. For indeed, of what should man be prideful of? If he has wealth, it is God who makes one prosperous. And if honor, does honor not belong to God? If he takes pride in wisdom, let him understand that God may remove the speech of the most competent and take away the wisdom of the aged. In other words, what do we have to boast of that hasn't been given to us by God? And if it is from God, we should humbly acknowledge its source rather than boast that we are in some way responsible for that thing of which we boast. And speaking of boasting, this next point may make us feel uncomfortable. One thing that distinguishes our religious community from nearly all other Christian denominations are our doctrines and our, what I would call, above average knowledge of the Scriptures. We strive to be a people of the book, reading the Bible daily, having weekly Bible studies. We have Bible conferences from time to time. We have Bible schools every year. We have Bible magazines that we subscribe to and read from cover to cover, etc., etc. Although this might sound odd, there is a danger in all of this Bible. In our pursuit of Bible truth, we can run the risk of becoming an arrogant sect. And if we aren't on our guard, we can end up being puffed up with pride on account of our Bible knowledge and our separation from the mainstream. If Paul's observation in 1 Corinthians is true, that is, knowledge puffeth up, then we need to be particularly careful in our attitudes regarding those who are outside of our community. We don't want to come across to others as a proud group who are known for constantly waving a banner saying, "We have the truth," with a capital T, and proclaiming that all other groups are lost. If this is how other groups see us, then I fear there's something wrong with our public image. Now, don't get me wrong. Of course, we must have confidence in our faith. And of course, we must preach with conviction. And yes, we must strive not to teach false doctrine on matters of first principles. However, it is possible for a person who seeks Bible knowledge to go too far and to fall into the sin of pride. In this case, the pride of knowing the Bible. The aim of Bible study should not be the mere acquisition of knowledge, nor should we pursue Bible knowledge solely for gaining a position of honor above the rest of our brothers and sisters in Christ. It makes no difference whether you are a Christadelphian or not. A humble person should never have too high an opinion of their own judgment or too low an estimate of those who oppose or disagree with them. Humility requires that we take the time to listen to another point of view and to be able to recognize that we might be wrong about something. And if we fail to keep these things in mind, we run the risk of becoming like the Pharisee that Jesus described in the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, which our brother read for us at the beginning. It is interesting to note that in this story, Jesus never once criticized the Pharisee for his beliefs. It was the Pharisee's prideful attitude that resulted from his religious beliefs that Jesus found fault with. Recall the passage. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, "God, I thank thee that I am not as other men are, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even as this publican. I fast twice in a week. I give tithes of all that I possess." Look, there's nothing wrong with fasting or tithing, avoiding extortion, or abstaining from adultery. The Pharisee, in fact, should definitely be commended for all these things. But the problem with this Pharisee was with his attitude toward others. He elevated himself in the sight of God above his neighbor. He saw himself better than others. His problem was with pride. There was no humility in his prayer. He thanked God that he was not like this riff-raff tax collector who somehow found his way into the temple. But in the parable, Jesus says that it was the tax collector who left the temple justified in the eyes of God. Now, justified is just a fancy way of saying that God found the tax collector's prayer of humility acceptable. Even though the tax collector's past lifestyle and conduct, perhaps even his theology, left a lot to be desired. In conclusion, if we adopt the mindsets that I've tried to share and sketch out this morning, then there should be no room for arrogance in our lives. Instead, humility should become a natural state of being for us. And with humility should come self-mastery. Now, there's a sobering little phrase found twice in the book of Proverbs I want to share with you. It's first found in Proverbs 15, verse 33, and then it's also repeated in chapter 18, verse 12. And these two proverbs, at their conclusion, state, before honor is humility. Before honor is humility. Humility must come before honor. This is God's order, not man's order. And for this reason, humility has never been popular. It certainly is not popular today. You'd be hard-pressed to find humility portrayed in a positive manner on the television. It would be rare to find it in the entertainment world, or in politics, or in professional sports, which probably is why we rarely find humility in the real world in which we live. But you will find humility when we focus our minds upon the table before us. Jesus said that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And the emblems on this table remind us of these facts. These emblems speak of Jesus' humility. And I believe Philippians 2 will help explain what I mean. And we find this in verse 3. At verse 3, we're told, do nothing out of selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility. Consider others as more important than yourselves. Everyone should look out not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others. And skipping ahead to verse 8, referring to Jesus, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even to death on a cross. For this reason, God highly exalted him and gave him the name that is above every name, so that at the name of Jesus, every knee will bow in heaven and on earth and under the earth. Jesus, in his death and his subsequent exaltation by God, unquestionably confirms the proverb that I read earlier, and that is, before honor is humility. Peter echoes this sentiment when he writes in his epistle, all of you clothe yourselves with humility toward one another, because God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. In light of such passages, and in light of the emblems that are before us that we're about to partake of, we must recognize that whatsoever other spiritual qualities we might possess, whether it might be courage, whether it be knowledge, whether it be service, whether it be faith, all of these things will avail us little unless we can add to them a spirit of humility. In closing, let us not forget the words of our once humbled but now exalted future King of all the earth, when he said, blessed are the meek, for they too shall inherit the earth. Thank you for your attention.